Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of BB Book Buzz, the show where your friendly librarians gather to talk about the books they've been reading recently. Today I have with me Jeff Clapes, Jackie Powers, and Brigid Black, and I am Karen Stern. And we're going to start today with Jeff, who has the uncharacterizable Jenny Awful's
Sure.
Weather to talk about.
Yes, it's actually Offill, even though it sounds awful. And I have to admit, this was perfect for me. I only picked her up because I was in the mood for some fiction, and I don't know about you guys, but I've found that during this pandemic year, my attention and focus is completely different from what it normally is. So
Absolutely.
following through something really long is kind of, I'm finding it hard for me. So she writes mostly very short fiction, and I came across her because she was on a list of recommended fiction for this year, just, some of the better books of 2020. So her latest book called Weather came out, I think, in February or March. She's probably better known for The Department of Speculation, which is very similar and came out maybe 5 years ago. But I decided this was just perfect for me. It's not very long. It's only like 175 pages, maybe. And she writes in a very, very fragmented style. It's almost poetic. Each one is like just a little paragraph, but they're so perfectly written, and they do link together. It's hard for me to talk about the book in any way that would divulge any spoilers, because really isn't a plot. The story is about a young woman named Lizzie. It's contemporary. Lizzie is a librarian, another reason I grabbed it. And she lives in Brooklyn, and she's married, she has a kid, but the biggest aspect of her personality that figures in the story is that she's one of those people who is psychiatrist to the world. You know how sometimes you're just like, people come to you with their problems and you feel like you need to be the one to help them. So she's got a mother who's kind of a little bit overly religious in weird ways. She has a brother who's a recovering drug addict. And over the course of the story, he finally gets his life together enough to find a girlfriend and get married and have a kid. So that throws things off in a different direction. And for Lizzie herself, she had a mentor when she works at a college library right now. And in the past, her academic mentor, who is now a sort of influencer, she's famous, she has a podcast, she travels all over the world, and her focus is kind of on climate change. That's where the title of the book comes from. And Lizzie herself is kind of obsessed with worrying about climate change. So she hooks up with this old mentor of hers who gives her a job offer that she at first isn't happy with, but ends up deciding to take. And that's to answer all of this woman's psychotic emails that she gets because she's famous, she gets emails from all kinds of people, and they're insane, and they're from all over the political spectrum, right and left and everything in between. And so it's Lizzie's job to answer all of these people. So the book, I'm actually going to just read you a couple of 2 paragraphs just to give you an idea of what she's like. I mean, literally the book is a continuous series of maybe paragraphs that are maybe only 2 or 3 sentences long. It's never more than that. And so I found it perfect as the kind of book that if your attention span is just not focusing right now, it's a perfect book for that, because you can just dip into it and read little bits and then put it down, and it doesn't disturb the flow. Here's one where she's just describing, and I just found this so poignant. She's describing her young child. She says, "A few days later, I yelled at him for losing his new lunchbox, and he turned to me and said, 'Are you sure you're my mother? Sometimes you don't seem like a good enough person.'" He was
Sounds right. I know those moments really well.
Yeah. He was just a kid, so I let it go. And now, years later, I probably only think of it, I don't know, once or twice a day.
Love it.
And so you can see that it's humorous, but it's also, there's a little heart tugging now and then. And there's also at some point she has some ups and downs with her husband, and there's a guy who comes into the library that she gets to know and is kind of flirting with, and the guy in the green coat keeps glancing at me. From the library, I tell him, and he nods slowly and respectfully, it seems. Yes, that's it, he says. He has a slight accent, and I wonder if he comes from some distant country where librarians are held in high esteem. So each of those, that's about as long as any paragraph is in any of this. And it's just a sequence of these that go together. She herself is quoted as saying, for me, people's emotional life is plot. So beyond what I've told you, there really isn't.
Ooh, I like that. I think that's something
I
great.
do too.
And I found it perfect just for the time that I'm going through right now, where, you know, the book club that I'm doing is all classics, and they tend to be long and ponderous and full of, you know, so this was the perfect antidote to reading things like that, where you can just bounce in and out. But on the other hand, I do find her really deep, because it's all these little fragmented poetic things. They're almost like haikus, except the subject matter that she's dealing with bounces between the minutia of daily life, like, you know, what your kid said, or his lunchbox, but also she deals a lot with Lizzie's and the other characters dealing with really major life issues, and the world that we're all a part of, that's dealing with climate change, and that's dealing with drug addiction and relationships coming together and falling apart. And so she's kind of talking about how on any given day, all of us are dealing with these different layers simultaneously, and just how challenging that is. So I found she sees the humor in that, but it's also I found it very bittersweet and poignant in a lot of places. And her writing is just beautiful. It's really beautiful. But if you're afraid of, you know, literary fiction, this is so easy to get into. It's not at all difficult. And so I ended up going back and reading The Department of Speculation, which is different characters, different issues, but very similar writing style. So if you liked one, you'd love the other. So that's, her name is Jenny Offill, Offill. And this is her new one it's called Weather.
Definitely going on the list.
I think I read that. I kept thinking, this sounds familiar, but I think it's because I think I read the first one.
Yeah. Department of Speculation,
if they're similar, that might be.
Was big a few years ago when it came out. I think it was on the New York Times, and she's been nominated for a number of different literary fiction awards. So she's kind of a known name.
Okay, Jackie's got a mystery for us.
A mystery, a thriller. One of the few standalones I've read lately. I feel like all the mysteries and things I've read lately have been part of a series, and this one was
You've
not.
been reading Penny, right?
I stole it from you, Karen.
I love it. It's good.
It's a good one.
I like this one.
This one I read on Leanne's recommendation, our own Leanne Ellis, who joined us last time. It's called 8 Perfect Murders. It's by Peter Swanson. It is not his first book. He's written several, but this was the first time I had read him. It takes one of the reasons Leanne suggested it to me was because it takes place in Boston, which I sometimes love and sometimes hate. If they do it right, I love it. If they do it wrong, I get really angry. He does it fairly well. He does. The main character, Malcolm, owns a bookstore in Beacon Hill. He co-owns it with an author who feels like kind of a James Patterson-y kind of author, like fairly prolific, sort of phoning it in at this point, like that kind of in that vein, but writes mysteries. And it is strictly a mystery bookstore. And it's supposed to be in Beacon Hill. And I think he does that area very well. He kind of, the way he describes some of the customers, you're like, oh, they're like the, yeah, the kind of old money, like brick, brownstone Beacon Hill people you can see. And he talks about some of the stores without naming them by name, but I know the stories he's referencing. And so he does that quite well. He does live in Massachusetts. I don't think he lives in Boston, the author. But so Malcolm owns this store, and runs it and has worked there, had worked there long before he had an opportunity to buy it. So many years ago, he had started this blog and it didn't do very well and nobody read it. And he's, I think, it's the store's blog and he's occasionally gone back and updated it, but it's not really a thing. But he did one post that was called 8 Perfect Murders. And it took, it was his 8 best murder mysteries, in that, not that they were necessarily the best mysteries ever written or that they were the best books of the genre, but they were the ones where you'd effectively be the least likely to get caught. Like they were the mysteries where you would that you would get away.
They were the perfect
they were the perfect murders. They were clever. They were well thought out. And those are all real. So the ones, so he lists like the ABC murders and like The Stranger, the real books though. So fast forward like 15 years after he's written this blog post, and then he's approached by an FBI agent who says to him that the agent thinks that someone is copying his list. Someone is actually murdering people and using this list of books as a guide. So what follows is possibly one of the most unreliably narrated stories I've ever read. Like you're reading and you're thinking, okay, like you think you got to have a handle on him, and then he says something and you're like, oh no, whoa. And it keeps unraveling and unraveling and unraveling and unraveling. And it was funny, one of the books reviews I read of it.
It's the bookstore owner, the narrator?
What's that? Is
the bookstore owner the narrator?
Yes, sorry, the bookstore. Yes, he's the narrator. It's first person, and he, one of the reviews I had read said that they thought it was almost like just shy of too clever for its own good. Like it's just right up there,
right?
But it's very twisty. I wouldn't say that the writing itself is anything special. It's fairly, because it's in the first person, it's fairly conversational. He's telling you this story. And it's not, literary in any meaningful way, but the plot, this is one of those books where you read for the pace and you read for the plot. I think I read it in like 2 days, which right now for me is saying quite a lot because I don't have a lot of time. But you really do want to get to the end and find out how it ended. And I think I mentioned in a more recent one about a different mystery I read that I actually guessed the ending, which is not typically something I'm able to do. This one I really didn't guess it. Like I was way off, which is always kind of fun when you really don't see something coming.
That's what you want coming.
Yeah. And so I had a couple issues with some of the way that the character is drawn a little bit. There were some parts I found like slightly not believable, but it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't make any difference.
You're in it for the ride.
It's not this one's not about the character. It's not about his feelings really. It's more about the plot itself. And for me, it was plot's not always enough for me. I usually need something else, but the setting here really, it being set in Boston really made a difference for me. But I would recommend that to anyone who likes a fast-paced kind of page-turnery.
Is it all horror? It's reminding me of Horowitz just because of the kind of
yes,
it's place kind of, like Horowitz does it in London, but it's like very much
and the sort of meta aspect
and the kind of meta-ness of it.
Yeah. Yes, that's a really good comparison. It is like that. It's not quite as like I think Horowitz does the characters in that book in those books really well.
Right.
This one's not quite there, but it's in that very much in that same vein that because he's the narrator and it's he's part of the story in that same way that Horowitz kind of puts himself in there too.
We're talking about Anthony Horowitz here, who has most recently written. Well, he wrote the ones that are meta are like Magpie Murders and The Word is Murder.
A Word is Murder.
The Word is Murder. Yeah.
Yeah. I always want to say M is for murder, but that's somebody else.
Somebody else.
Anyway, but okay. I highly recommend it. Shout out to one of my favorite patrons, Mr. Smith. I feel like this was a book for him.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Should he call?
We will tell him. And give us the name and the title and the author again.
8 Perfect Murders. It was by Peter Swanson.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna go next with a historical, essentially. So it's not a new book. It actually came out in 2017, but it's one worth mentioning, especially for those of you who like a good old-fashioned family saga, or if you're a history buff, or if you read especially for place and period details. This is called Pachinko, my dog-eared copy, and it's by Min Jin Lee, and it spans the decades from the early part of the 20th century through 1989, so a really big span. And that is essentially the span of the central character's life. And her name is Sunja, and we first meet her when she's born into this honest, hardworking peasant family who runs a guest house in what is now South Korea, in a town by the sea. And she's born just after the Japanese have invaded and occupied Korea in the early part of the century. And then when she's in her late teens, she's noticed by a handsome, sort of obviously wealthy, much older man whose name is Kol Hansu, and he pursues her. She falls in love and becomes pregnant. But when she finds out that he already has a wife in Japan, because he's Korean, but he works in Japan, as you know, there was a lot of links between them besides and as well the occupation. She refuses to become his mistress, and this is kind of the first of many acts of strength that we see from Sunja, who faces a lot of difficulties and heartbreaks throughout her long life. So hiding her pregnancy and thinking about the shame that is, you know, sure to come when people find out, she accepts an offer of marriage from a young, handsome Korean man called Isak, who is on his way to Japan to become a minister in a Christian church. And Isak knows about her pregnancy, but inspired by his faith, decides to marry her and call the child his own. So that is the seed of the story that is the beginning of this saga of like 4 generations of Sunja's family, so they all are Koreans living in Japan, and being treated very much as second-class citizens in Japan as the century moves through the Second World War and into the modern age. And that history, the history of the relationship between Japan and Korea, is kind of almost like a character. I hate to say it that way, but it is a little bit in the story. It was kind of, for me, one of the most interesting parts of the book, because I didn't know almost anything about that place and time. So this is an immigrant story, and the stories will echo many of the immigrant stories that we hear in our own country. It takes on issues of both race and class. It's also the personal story of Sunja, her sons, their children. And by the time we get to the grandchildren, they are wealthier, they have more choices in life, but they are still held back by their status as Koreans in Japan. It's also a history of women. There's Sunja, there's her mother, who eventually comes to live with them in Japan. Sunja's beloved sister-in-law is a big character in the book, and a bunch of other girlfriends and wives and lovers who Lee kind of weaves into the story to show us both how much things have changed for women, and in some ways how little they've changed for women in those cultures. One thing to note about the structure of the story, you might kind of like think about how Lee covers that much time in a single book, and it is a long book. She does it by giving us that historical arc of history and Sunja's life, and then dipping in to take these like snapshots throughout that arc that give us insights into both the history itself and what's happening to the family, their kind of trials and tribulations along the way. So some people who like, who are more interested in continuity and they want to live with their characters all the way through might find that kind of a disjointed experience. But other people who are more interested in the sweep and change of history and how it affects people will probably find this really great.
This is really sounding like Lisa C. to me, like a lot.
It
like
is.
Particularly The Island of Sea Women.
Well, The Island of Sea Women it's a very, very different book. And I think they're written for 2 different audiences. Like this one is for, like I said at the beginning, history buffs and people who like a long drawn out family saga. Whereas The Island of the Sea Women gets much more into literally details of
it was one person's life. Yeah.
It's one person's life, right? And it's funny. I gave up on the Island of Sea Women, which surprised me a little bit because I thought that I would like that more than this. Anyway, they're two very different books about a similar period in history, so you could choose one or the other.
Well,
depending on
like you said, the part about the history, the history in the Island of Sea Women, I found really compelling. The plot itself was very difficult. Like
Right.
the content itself was really hard, but the history for me made that book a lot more
Right.
palatable. Kind of
And
putting it in its
that is
historical
definitely
place.
what I felt about Pachinko. I mean, there's a lot of hard stuff in here too, but I was interested in learning all this stuff. And one of the things that I learned about is when you come to the title of the book, which is actually something really important in the book. Pachinko, one of my people in my book club, we did this book last night for Books by the Lake, and she was like, I kept wanting to know, who's Pachinko? When am I going to meet Pachinko? And then she found out that Pachinko isn't actually who. It's a what? It's actually this hugely popular game in Japan.
Yeah,
it's a little bit like pinball, and they're kind of upright, and all the balls go running through. But their pachinko parlors are a huge thing in Japan, and a lot of Koreans ended up working in the pachinko parlors because it was all that they were sort of considered good enough to do in Japan. And so that world and the underworld of pachinko and gambling parlors is the backdrop for much of the book, and the ups and the downs of the family are very much interwoven with it. So I think the best thing about this book for me was the way Lee takes you into this time and place that I personally knew nothing about, and made me know the characters so well that they stopped being either Korean or Japanese and just became human beings. And that is what Lee sets out to do with her writing. She has said that she's really interested in creating radical empathy through art. She believes that literature is especially good at, getting us human beings to actually see each other as human beings instead of, dehumanizing entire populations with a single word. This way of getting into people's lives and showing us these universal themes of bravery and shame and family and duty and what it means to be at home, which is a big theme of this book, makes people human, makes characters human, and makes you understand people in general much better. So that was my takeaway from this book, and she does that very, very well. So that's Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. And next, we have Brigid, who has something fun. Well, is it?
It's another page turner thriller. We'll go there. So I'm going to discuss celebrated author Alyssa Cole's newest book. She extends her reach into a new genre. She's quite well known in romance, but this is her first thriller. It's called When No One Is Watching, and it is, as described by her, a gentrification thriller. So it is set in a Brooklyn neighborhood, which has historically been a Black neighborhood and is rapidly and perhaps alarmingly quickly becoming white. So the main character is Sydney, who grew up in the neighborhood and lives in her mother's house. So her mother owns a brownstone. She lives in an apartment so her mother lives on like the first floor, Sydney lives on the second floor, and Sydney's best friend, Drea, lives on the third floor. So they live in these 3 apartments. Her mother is not at home. Her mother was very ill, and her whereabouts are sort of a mystery that you come to find. But we follow Sydney as she's living in this house and noticing the changes in her neighborhood and how fast they are going on, and that it's alarming to her. She also has a history with her marriage has recently ended, and it ended poorly, with her husband accusing her of being crazy, essentially, like saying this. So she has reasons to sort of doubt herself, but she doesn't really doubt her sanity. When she notices things that are off, she doesn't necessarily like immediately react to them, because she has this part in her where it's like, no, you're being crazy, because people have told her that. So it's kind of a very relatable experience, I think, for some women who've been told that their intuitions are wrong. So it is told in two first-person point of views. One is Sydney, and the other first person is Theo, who is one of the white gentrifiers who's moved into the neighborhood. He has a story too. He's not necessarily typical of what you might expect for someone to move in, but we sort of find out more about him as we go through. I thought this book was super fast-paced, and I read it in basically a day. Like, you'll read it in a day. So it's so fast. It really draws you through. It is obviously kind of dark because it is about very serious subjects that are based in real things, even if the exact nature of the threat to gentrification in this book is heightened, shall we say. It's obviously based in real life and real facts that affect people today. The other thing is, so it's told in these two first persons, and also some chapters end with little asides from a sort of Nextdoor style app that are conversations between neighbors, where people will be like, someone stole my bike, and it's like, well, where did you park your bike? Or like, did anyone see those like weird cars going through the neighborhood? So you kind of get like more of an impression of what's going on, and also insight from sort of the villains who are like the white gentrifiers. You get some insights from them and their public posts in this group. So it's definitely heavy, but it's also, Cole has a real, her writing style can be very funny and has lots of good humorous sort of asides and jokes in it. There's a line in the first chapter that I really, really love, but I cannot say here because it is inappropriate to this form. So you can see, but it just like sort of sets the tone for what the book is like. And I really appreciated it.
So you have to be careful.
Yeah. So not everyone gets a happy ending, though it doesn't. So despite the darkness, it isn't like an unhappy ending, but not everyone comes out perfect at the end. It is a little violent. It's definitely has those thriller aspects. I just think it's just like, it's going to be one of those books described as timely, but it's kind of timeless at the same time, because this is not something that like just happens now. It's an issue that people see all the time, and it's a lot about where you belong, what is your neighborhood, who are you, and what would you do to fight to keep your community safe. Like, what is community, and how what is worth fighting for. And I will say the description on the book describes it as Get Out meets Rear Window, which actually is a pretty good
interesting.
Because obviously, as you can say, there's obviously the racial aspects of Get Out, and also it's a lot of like spying on your neighbors from inside your house.
But come on, it's Alyssa Cole. There's no romance at all.
I was gonna say, yeah.
I will say there is a romance subplot. Obviously, as I can say, there's two first-person points of views, which is one, Sydney, who's a woman, and Theo, who is a man. There is indeed a romantic attraction there.
How does it compare to her romances? Do you think she does this as well?
I think she does. I will say this. I think she does, because the characters, the things you like about her romances, or the things I like about her romances, are like the relatable characters, and even in sort of absurd plot twists, it maintains like a core of realism is still there here. So that's where it's like she still has the characters, they still have strong connections, and obviously, yes, it's like it takes place in a heightened reality, but she manages to maintain that connection to reality in the way she does in her romances.
And does it feel like a thriller? I mean, does it really feel like a
thriller?
It
really does, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Like I would say the romantic subplot is absolutely just a subplot. It is not the central part of it, and if it hadn't, you could lift it out and you would still have you'd still have a book that would work as well. So it definitely has a very good thriller. and a mystery that like I'll say this, it's like you can start putting together before the characters do, but that's also because you're seeing more information than either one of them is. So you
Right.
can kind of put it together, but it's still like can surprise you at the end. It has some good surprises and twists and turns.
Cool. Great. Well, I think that's what we got for today. Thank you guys for all your contributions. I'll definitely be putting, I think, all of those on my list. So until next time, we will be back in a couple of weeks with another installment. We'll see you for the next Book Buzz. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.